Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Composting Collaborative webinar. We'll be starting the actual presentation portion of the webinar in just a couple of minutes. For now, I'd like to greet everyone and welcome you. This is Nora Goldstein, editor of BioCycle, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. The Composting Collaborative was founded about 2 years ago by BioCycle, the U.S. Composting Council, and Green Blue. And its mission is to accelerate composting access and infrastructure to improve soil health and divert compostables from landfill. The Composting Collaborative getting the hang of it here. The Composting Collaborative unites composters, consumer-facing businesses, and policymakers to share best practices and resources, as well as generate innovative solutions to shared challenges. The collaborative hosts 2 in-person meetings a year. The next one will be at WasteCon in Nashville in August. We produce a quarterly newsletter, and we engage in many areas of research and project work, and of course run this monthly webinar series. And just quickly, the theme of the July webinar will be initiatives, composting initiatives, and organics diversion initiatives at universities and institutions. We will be getting started shortly. Thank you. Greetings, everybody. Welcome to the Composting Collaborative's June webinar. This is Nora Goldstein, editor of BioCycle, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. The social science of organics recycling, designing programs that change behavior. Behavior is a fundamental element of any recycling program, whether it is materials recycling or organics recycling. With investments made to date in organics diversion, we all ask these 2 questions and many others, but these 2 for now. What will it take to get more people to participate in the service being offered? Second, what are strategies to reduce and ideally eliminate contaminants in the collected organic stream? Our speakers today, Jennifer Tabanico and Caitlin Phelps with Action Research, will tackle this fundamental element. Action Research is a firm with more than 15 years of experience changing human behavior through the application of traditional marketing activities blended with cutting-edge research findings from social and behavioral sciences. I'd like to introduce Jennifer and Caitlin to you. Jennifer Tabanico is president and owner of Action Research, a firm that specializes in changing behavior for the public good by applying marketing and social science research to outreach programs that promote clean, healthy, and sustainable communities. Jennifer has a Master of Arts degree in experimental psychology and more than 15 years of experience with community-based programs for public and private agencies. Her work spans water quality, waste and recycling, litter prevention, energy efficiency, water conservation, and sustainable forestry. Among the clients she has worked for include the City and County of San Diego, the American Forest Foundation, and the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. Caitlin Feltz of Action Research has a Master of Science degree in Natural Resources Environment from the University of Michigan, as well as extensive coursework in the social sciences. She has built her career on improving the environment and creating sustainable communities through effective programming that fosters voluntary behavior change. Her area of expertise across a multitude of environmental and sustainability topics include recycling, composting, watershed stewardship, and urban agriculture. Katie has served a lead role on several projects, including Keep America Beautiful and in California with the County of Alameda and the City of Sunnyvale. Jennifer, the firm's president and owner, will walk you all through the principles and practices of community-based social marketing, highlighting why current practices from outreach campaigns to training sessions may not be delivering desired results, and how to develop new tools. Caitlin will follow with exemplary case studies that highlight how these behavior change tools have been effectively applied in residential and commercial organics collection programs. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone that we will be recording this webinar and we'll distribute the recording and slides to attendees later today or tomorrow morning. And while we've muted the phone lines, please do ask questions that the speakers will answer during the Q&A through the chat box in the bottom left-hand corner. And now, Jennifer, I turn it over to you. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Nora, for the excellent introduction. Again, this is Jennifer Tabanico, President of Action Research. And the topic of this webinar is very central to our mission, so really excited to be a part of this webinar today. As Nora mentioned, our mission is sparking behavior changes for good by applying both marketing and social science research to outreach programs that promote clean, healthy, and sustainable communities. We've been applying this model, and specifically community-based social marketing, for more than 15 years across a wide range of topics. Getting our early starts in pollution prevention, working with things like litter and stormwater quality, and then moving into energy conservation, water conservation, and a variety of topics in between. So most recently, we've got a number of clients and areas where we've been focusing on organics recycling, both in increasing participation, but also in reducing contamination. So I wanted to start first about talking about why behavior even matters. Why do people with backgrounds in psychology really want to be involved in this space, and how can they help us? So when we look at just about any environmental issue, we can see that there are origins in human behavior, whether we're talking about climate change, air, water pollution, species loss, deforestation, natural resource depletion, or waste, which is no exception. All of these issues have origins in the daily decisions and choices and actions of individuals. And traditionally, one of the ways that we've approached these environmental problems is through technology solutions. So we come up with more effective composting technologies, for example. Or we've addressed them through policy solutions by placing limits on what can go to the landfill. But even within these approaches, we still have a behavioral element. If you develop a new technology and people don't adopt that, or it doesn't penetrate the market, or people don't use it effectively, you don't get the environmental benefits that you anticipated. Similarly with policy, if people aren't in compliance with new regulations, or if a lot of enforcement or oversight is needed, you're not getting the benefit that you hope those policies would get you to in terms of environmental outcomes. And additionally, policies take time to get passed, and they take time to make it through. And so getting people engaged on a voluntary behavior first can provide more support for policies as they move forward. So because of that, we can find a lot of solutions on the behavior side. And because those solutions are grounded in behavior, we can look to the social sciences for help in designing effective programs. So not only does behavior matter, but as it turns out, also the behavior matters. So even within a very common domain, general domain, such as organics recycling, there are a variety of behaviors that people can engage in. Some of these are one-time behaviors, such as buying or assembling a composter. And others are more repetitive, such as taking food scraps out to a composter on a regular basis or regular weekly participation in a curbside collection program. Additionally, each of those behaviors has its own barriers associated with it. So the reason someone might not want to purchase and use a backyard composter might be very different than the reasons they don't want to collect food scraps and take those out to the curb. So even within that single domain, we see a wide variety of behaviors and also reasons that people don't engage in those specific behaviors. So I just want to take a minute now and talk about how we have traditionally approached behavior change. And if you look at the landscape of behavior change programs across environment, health, and public safety, you'll see a predominance of what we call information-intensive campaigns. And these campaigns are the large ad campaigns typically using traditional media that focus on one of two or both paths. The first are a knowledge-based campaign. And these are based on the assumption that if people know what to do, they will certainly do it. So we build websites and fact sheets and brochures. We hold workshops. We buy radio ads and put up billboards with the hope that if people just knew that they were supposed to compost their food scraps, or if they just knew that it was important to do so, they would certainly do it. Unfortunately, the research is pretty clear in showing that simply having knowledge about how to do something or that you should do something is not sufficient motivation in many cases for behavior change. The other path that we often see is more of an awareness campaign. And these campaigns take the approach that if people just knew the severity of the issue, they would certainly change. So if people just knew about the great amount of waste, of food waste in particular, that is going to the landfill that could be composted or otherwise used, and they saw the depleting space in landfills, and if they just knew about the methane release of these materials and the impact on the environment, they would certainly change their behavior. But again, research is clear in showing that simply having a favorable attitude towards something doesn't necessarily translate into behavior change. And I think we could just pause for a minute and probably each think about an action that we probably know how to take and we know we should take, but we maybe don't take. Maybe we think we should exercise more, or we should ride our bike to work, or ourselves, we should participate more regularly in composting organics collection programs. So I mentioned that the research has demonstrated that these approaches are not effective. So I just want to give two examples of this where we've tested this concept. This first study comes from Scott Geller from Virginia Tech, where he looked at the impact of a series of energy conservation workshops on individual behavior change. In this particular example, he tested sort of the upper threshold of what you can probably do feasibly with a program. And by that I mean that Scott Geller spent a significant amount of time with a very highly motivated audience. This was a series of energy conservation workshops that was advertised in the local paper where people were invited, the first 40 people who signed up, to attend a 3-hour workshop on energy efficiency within their homes. And in that workshop, they learned about simple one-time and repetitive actions they could take in their homes to save energy. And they tested the attitudes and knowledge of these participants before and after participating in the workshop. And they learned that people were both more knowledgeable about the things that they could do in their home to save energy and had more favorable attitudes about energy conservation following the workshop. However, in a follow-up evaluation looking at actual behavior change among those very highly motivated 40 participants who were the first to sign up to spend 3 hours in a one-on-one workshop, only one of those 40 participants lowered the hot water heater temperature on their hot water heater, which is in most cases a pretty simple one-time action. Slightly more positive in that second finding is that 2 of the 40 installed a hot water heater wrap. A bit more impressive given that this takes a little bit more effort to go buy the hot water heater wrap and install it. However, both of those participants, the study later found, had installed that hot water heater wrap before coming to the workshop. And the last finding is that 8 of 40 installed a low flow shower head. So this again is 40 people who spent 3 hours. We got 8 out of that 40 to install a low flow shower head. That result sounds impressive until I tell you that all 40 of them had received a low flow shower head as part of the workshop. So the point here is that even when you've got intense one-on-one educational time with a highly motivated audience, you don't always get behavior change. And that's an indication that there may be other barriers at play that are not being addressed. In another example, which is probably more like what most programs look like, a water conservation program developed a handbook showing for residents of a particular community, illustrating how they could save water in and outside of their home, and also talking about the relationship between energy use and water. The study looked at residential water use over 10 weeks and randomly assigned neighborhoods or households to either receive this handbook or not. So imagine that you received the handbook, but maybe your next door neighbor didn't, and 3 doors down they did. So this was at random. Some people received it and some people didn't. And then over 10 weeks, they monitored the water use of these groups. And in looking at the control group that did not get the handbook and the experimental group that did, there was no difference in their water use. And these are very expensive printed informational manuals. We also see on the state and national campaign side that have spent millions of dollars advertising socially beneficial behaviors like energy conservation or nutrition, a very small or no associated behavior change with these large campaigns. So the Flex Your Power campaign, for example, in California advertised a wide range of energy efficiency actions, and the 10-year evaluation of that program showed high penetration and knowledge of the Flex Your Power brand, but very low to no behavior change associated with that. Similar, the 5-a-day campaign and the follow-up on that, Fruit and Veggies More Mattered, promoting healthy eating, also showed significant increases in knowledge and awareness of the program, but little to no behavior change associated with it. So why? Why, when we spend all of this money advertising, we've told people what to do, and we've made them more aware, do we not see behavior change? And one of the primary reasons for that is that these campaigns have typically focused on traditional marketing techniques and awareness and knowledge raising that we would use typically to shift a consumer preference. So you want somebody to buy a Coke instead of a Pepsi, or you want them to eat at Burger King instead of McDonald's. And those very often work for marketing, so we would expect it would work here. But unfortunately, when we're looking at a lot of environmental behaviors, and particularly with organics, generally we're trying to get people to, not only are we getting them to do something they're not doing already, we're trying to get them to do something that is likely more difficult, more costly, or more inconvenient than the alternative. And so what I want to spend the rest of the time talking about now is an approach that goes beyond that traditional marketing and addresses some of these other elements of engaging in environmental behaviors. And that process is community-based social marketing. Community-based social marketing is not new. It's been around for over 20 years, and it's also not a marketing technique. Community-based social marketing is a process with very strong origins in social science. Community-based social marketing is also community-based, and by that I mean that the programs that are developed from information gathered in the community, and they are often developed and or delivered at the community level, highlighting more in-person techniques wherever possible. Community-based social marketing also makes use of very social influences like social diffusion and community or social norms. It also addresses the barriers that we spoke about earlier, the other reasons that people don't engage in behavior, and it removes these barriers. And lastly, community-based social marketing is behavior-based. And by that I mean we're very focused on did behavior change the outcomes rather than what did we do, what are the outputs. So less concerned about how many people came to a workshop or how many people accepted a flyer or how many people liked our Facebook page. Those are typically outputs, where community-based social marketing focuses more heavily on outcomes. Did behavior change as a result of our program? Community-based social marketing has 5 steps, so I'm just going to walk through each of them very briefly here, and then I'll talk about each in more detail in the context of organics recycling. So first we begin by selecting a behavior. As I mentioned earlier, there are a wide range of behaviors and actions embedded in something like broadly called organics recycling. Once we've identified behaviors, we need to understand what are the barriers and benefits to those actions. By barriers, I mean what are the things that decrease the likelihood that people will engage in the behavior? And by benefits, I mean what are the things that increase the likelihood that people will engage in the behavior? And what are the benefits that people will get out of engaging in it? Only when we have that information do we move on to the third step, which is developing a strategy. And here we address the barriers and benefits and also leverage tools from the social sciences. Those strategies are then pilot tested on a small scale, and only when we demonstrate that they are both effective in changing behavior but also cost effective do we move on to the 5th step, which is broad scale implementation and evaluation. So diving a little bit further now into each step, first is around selecting behaviors. Here it is really important to make strategic selections of the behaviors to make sure that the behaviors that we're choosing are, one, important enough to address, so there are things that there's actually some room to move people, that people aren't all already doing the right thing, and that we're making informed choices. And the reason for this is due to something called confirmation bias, where we tend to make assumptions and view things that fit with our preconceived notions about what is happening. So if we believe that nobody is putting food scraps into an organics collection container, then we will kind of see more of that or assume more of that is happening than if we went actually out to look in the waste receptacles to see what people were actually doing. So we make assumptions based on what we expect to see. So in this first choice about selecting behaviors, we really want to bring in technical and survey data in making choices about which behaviors make the most sense to target. It may be that people are putting most things in the bin correctly, but there's 1 or 2 particular items that are not making it into the bin or making it into the wrong bin. So I'll show you an example of what I mean by this. First, we want to start really broadly. So we might look at the overall composition of what is going to the landfill. And we see, and we all generally know, that a great proportion of that is food and also yard trimmings and other organic material. So that kind of tells us where it is important to focus. If we were really looking at diversion from the landfill and looking at this composition, we're probably not going to be focusing so much on glass as these other larger chunks of the pie. And this is really important because the reasons that people might not recycle their glass are going to be different than the issues that are associated with food, which are different than issues associated with yard trimmings. But we can break this down even further. So say we are looking at, we break off that food side of the pie. Well, who is associated with that food going to the landfill? And as you can see by this chart, also from the EPA, a large proportion of that is from the residential sector. Slightly smaller, the restaurant side, and smaller yet, institutions and grocery stores. So this would tell us that residential organics collection programs is a good place to start. And I know many of you on the call are probably working in that space. But again, we can break this down even further. I'm breaking off a restaurant example here. If we just look at food waste collection within restaurants, there are many different behaviors even that are associated with that. So some of that waste is going to be coming at the point of food preparation. Some of that waste is going to be coming at the point of customer plates. And some of that waste is coming from spoilage. And the way that you handle each of those issues is going to be different. So there's a whole list of things you can do related to food preparation, to compost or even reduce the amount of waste, similarly with spoilage or customer plates. Contamination rates may be different as well across these different areas. So by taking the data that you have and breaking it down and really looking at where the behaviors are, it can really help you to focus your program. And the important part of focusing a program is that we tend to give people long lists of behaviors that they can engage in. However, people have a finite amount of attention. In addition to an organics collection program, they're probably being exposed to a water conservation program and an energy conservation program and a safety program through their kids' schools and a whole range of other messages. So our recommendation is typically to keep those programs down to 3 to 5 behaviors. And so we want to be really strategic about what we're asking people to do. So I'm going to walk through a method for selecting behaviors that may apply to some programs that are dealing with, wow, we have a range of things people could be doing, and how do we begin to narrow that down? So the first thing is to create a list of behaviors. And in creating that list, there's 3 things that should be considered. First, are the behaviors end state? That is, does the action cause the outcome? Purchasing a composter doesn't result in reduced material going to the landfill, but placing food scraps in a curbside collection bin does. So that would be the end state behavior. We also want to make sure the behaviors are non-divisible, and by that I mean they cannot be broken down into smaller actions. So broad messages like zero waste or recycle don't tell people what they should be doing, and there's many other behaviors that are embedded underneath that. And lastly, in listing out the potential behaviors you might target, it's very important to not list strategies. And by strategies, I mean things like sign a pledge, attend a workshop, visit a website. Those are activities that you hope will engage people in the behavior, but they're not behaviors and not end state behaviors by themselves. Once we have a list of behaviors that we feel is comprehensive, we then move to prioritizing those behaviors. And in doing so, we look at 4 different dimensions of that behavior. Number 1 is the impact, and that is how significant is the behavior. So in terms of organics, we're looking at how much weight or volume are we finding of a particular material going in the trash as opposed to an organics bin, or what items are the most common in terms of contamination in the organics bin. So we want to pick those behaviors that have a high impact on our ultimate outcome. Second, we look at probability, and that is how likely is adoption. So we want to pick those behaviors that are not only high impact, but that also have a high likelihood that people will engage in it. Third, we look at penetration. Penetration is the extent to which people are already doing the right thing. So ultimately, we want to be looking at behaviors that have low rates of penetration. Not a lot of people are doing it already. And then lastly, we look at applicability. For whom is it relevant? So this would be, for example, if you have a curbside collection program, what proportion of the overall residential community actually has this program available to them? So just to summarize, we're looking for behaviors that have a high impact, a high probability, low rates of penetration, so there's some room to move people, and high rates of applicability. And those behaviors that are most important to focus on will have the best combination of those 4 elements. Another issue to consider in developing the behavior list is whether any of those behaviors represent behavioral change. And what I mean here by a behavioral chain is that what we frequently refer to as a behavior is very often made up of a variety of sub-actions, each of which likely has its own set of barriers associated with them. So I'm going to give you an example here of a behavior chain for a food scrap collection and a restaurant. First, the restaurant would have to sign up. Then they would have to get bins. Then they would have to identify the bin locations. They would have to place those bins, remove any contamination from plates, scrape that food off the plate into a bin, take that bin to the dumpster, and then set out the container for collection on collection day. And then you could even add another step here to return the bins to their primary spot. And there may be many more steps depending on what your program looks like. The point here is that people could fall out of this process if the barriers are not effectively addressed at one step along the chain. For example, if the sign-up process is intense, or the paper application or a web application that's difficult to access, people might not ever get into the program. If the bins are too expensive or hard to find, they may not move past that step. Or if they don't have room to place the bins, they may not make it to that step. So it's very important to sketch out these behavior chains and ask yourself whether you've effectively addressed barriers at each step. So that kind of is the segue into the next step of community-based social marketing, which is identifying barriers and benefits. So here we want to understand why are people not engaging in the desired behavior and what can we do to make it more beneficial or easier for them to engage. As I mentioned earlier, barriers can vary not only by the behavior, but they can also vary by audience. So a more elderly or senior audience may experience different barriers than younger families, or certain cultures may experience different barriers. Barriers can vary by season. So in cold weather climates, the barriers to composting or even taking materials out to a curb can change when the weather becomes colder or warmer. And barriers can also change over time due to social influences and political influences. We can also have multiple barriers that exist simultaneously. So in conducting barrier and benefit research, the number one thing to remember is to not base this step on hunches. So in this 1-hour webinar, we won't have time to go into all of the different research methods that are available, but the take-home point here is to always get out of the office and talk to people in the target population and find out their reasons for not engaging in the behavior. As a starting point, we recommend that we always start with literature reviews to see what others have done in this space. So with networks like BioCycle and this collaborative, there's a lot of sharing that could happen in terms of what others have discovered in their programs about potential barriers. You can also conduct observations. This may be looking into waste receptacles, for example, to observe what people are actually doing. Focus groups, bringing people together for a broad discussion about potential barriers. And these types of more qualitative research efforts can help you to move to a more quantitative survey type of analysis where you're in person or by telephone, mail, web-based, or other methods asking people how much each of a variety of barriers are an issue for them. And this allows you to have a more quantitative analysis in which you can prioritize a long list of barriers. Only when we have that information about barriers and benefits then do we move on to the strategy step. And very often people like to skip to this step because this is the fun part. This is where you start putting a picture to it and you put scripts to it and here's what we could tell people and here are the images we can use. But we really have to resist the temptation to jump to this step until we have adequate barrier and benefit research. The benefit, though, of waiting is that once you have that barrier and benefit research in hand, it becomes very clear what you need to be doing, and the strategy development phase goes much quicker. So in developing a strategy, first we want to enhance motivation. And this takes priority over removing barriers because if people don't have any motivation to start down the path or to move forward, then the barriers are irrelevant. So barriers are addressed, but only after we've effectively addressed motivation. In this image here, you'll see a set of wavy lines at the top, and that represents motivation forward. And you'll see then that motivation moving forward then runs into a wall of barriers. So one thing we could do here in that top scenario, letter A, would be to either enhance motivation to get up over that barrier wall, or we could bring down those barriers so that the existing level of motivation sails right over. The best approach, though, is what you see in B there, where you simultaneously increase motivation and bring down that barrier wall. And that's what will get you most effectively to behavior change. Next, once we've addressed barriers and motivation, we look at how to leverage personal contact. So if you look at large-scale media campaigns, they rely most heavily on information and awareness through TV, radio, billboards, websites, and other mass media methods. However, the behavior change associated with those methods tends to be very low. While they're effective for raising knowledge and awareness, we don't see much behavior change. However, when we get closer to one-on-one personal contact, we don't reach as many people, but there's more likely to be behavior change as a result. So if you think about the last movie that you saw or the last book that you read, it's likely that you made that decision based on somebody else telling you about that rather than the movie trailer that you saw or the billboard that you saw driving into work. Lastly, in developing strategies, we leverage tools from the social sciences. And while there are a lot of tools available to us from the social sciences, we have over 100 years of research on how these tools work and how they can be effectively applied to programs. However, not every tool works for every job. So I want to spend the rest of my time talking before I turn it over to Katie, just highlighting a few of tools that are available for us, but really pinpointing when those tools are going to be most effective for you and the context in which they're most appropriate. So the first set of tools I wanted to talk about are tools that are emphasizing removing barriers. And those are education, convenience, and prompts. Although I spent the first part of this presentation talking about how education alone is not enough, knowledge itself can be a barrier. If people don't know how to do something or they don't know where to take something, then they need to have that knowledge in order to participate. So again, knowledge by itself is not motivation, but knowledge can be a barrier. So you may need to include educational materials, workshops, or other kinds of demonstrations in your program if you find that knowledge is an issue. Another way that we can address barriers is through convenience. Anytime that you can make it easier for people to participate in a program, you increase the likelihood that they will participate. And sometimes we have to think about if you make it convenient, we want to make it convenient for people to do the right thing. Sometimes by making it convenient, such as with single stream recycling, we've now made it easier for them to recycle, but we've also increased our likelihood for contamination. So in making it convenient, we've really got to balance those two sides when we're talking about recycling. And then lastly, another way to effectively remove barriers is through prompts. Prompts are a visual or auditory reminder. Often people don't act because they forget to act, and this is particularly the case with repetitive actions. So in these cases, visual or auditory reminders can help to facilitate change. So if you think of things like light switch signs reminding you to turn off the lights, or bin stickers reminding you what goes in a particular bin, text messages reminding you to make a particular appointment. These prompts have been used effectively across a wide range of domains, including in waste. Keep in mind that these are simple reminders rather than persuasive appeals. So we want to be very prescriptive in what we're asking people to do and emphasize the correct action. The other two components to remember here are that prompts are most effective when they're close in space and close in time to where the behavior occurs. So as you see here, the prompt stickers are placed right on the bin, right at that point where the disposal action occurs. The last two tools I want to talk about here are tools that we use to enhance motivation. And I chose two that are most common and also some of our most powerful tools in our social science toolbox. The first is commitments. Commitments work due to a process that Daryl Bem refers to as self-perception theory. Making a commitment alters the way that you see yourself. Also, consistency is seen as an important character trait, and we like to be seen as consistent between our commitments and our actions. So we like our actions to be in line with what we say we're going to do, and also with what we've done in the past, and also with how we see ourselves. Commitments are most effective when the individual is already motivated to act, but has not yet engaged in the actions. In the way that commitments are often operationalized are through things such as pledge cards, verbal statements, or online or signed pledges. These commitments have been demonstrated again to be effective across a wide range of behaviors, including in organics collection, energy efficiency, water conservation, and a variety of health topics. What we know across these implementation and testing of commitments are a few takeaways. Number one, commitments are more effective when they are written rather than when they are verbal. So whenever possible, we want people to write down their pledge rather than just tell you what they would commit to do. We also know that commitments are more effective when they are public rather than private. So a commitment that is handwritten and then posted publicly is going to be more effective, likely. And then lastly, we want commitments to be durable. So if you just post something up on a Facebook page, it's going to make its way down the feed very quickly over a few hours. That's not a very durable commitment compared to a commitment that's posted on a public posting board or on a kiosk at the entrance to a restaurant. So wherever possible, we want those commitments to be written and public and durable. Lastly, I want to talk about social norms, because this is one of the most powerful tools that we have available to us, and also part of the community in community-based social marketing. Norms are the common and accepted behaviors within a group. They represent both what other people do, so that is a descriptive norm, or what they approve of doing, which is referred to as an injunctive norm. Individuals tend to conform to the norm or the perceived norm even. So people are influenced not only by what other people are doing, but also by what they think other people are doing. We have a tendency to go with the flow. That's just human nature. And there's a long history of research on this normative social influence that has resulted in some clear and consistent findings. So one thing that we know about social norms is that they can work very well even if we don't know they're working. So these social norms then have an influence on us even outside of our awareness. So because of that, they can be used in situations where the audience is not already motivated to act. This is one of those tools that can be used to enhance motivation. So in energy efficiency, for example, we tend to see the largest effects, the largest influence of social norms on people that are using the most energy. If you've ever seen, and I'll show an example here on the next slide, of energy reports that provide information about how much energy your neighbors are using compared to your own. These have significant influence both on individual energy use, but particularly among those that are using a lot of energy. And that's because people want to be in line with what everybody else is doing. A couple of things to remember about social norms is because they are so powerful, it is very important to highlight the desired behaviors. So where a number of campaigns have gone wrong is in saying things like, look at all of these people who are not participating. Those messages inadvertently focus people on the norm that, hey, other people are not doing this, so why should I? So very important when using social norms to highlight the desired behaviors. If the desired behaviors are not happening with great frequency, then we can start with a tool called social diffusion, in which you're getting well-known and well-respected people to engage in the behavior, making that engagement public, and then bringing along others slowly through conversations until you have a norm. The other thing to remember about social norms is that when you're talking about a comparison group, comparing people to their neighbors is appropriate, but you wouldn't want to compare them to a political advocacy group or an environmental group or anyone else that might be perceived as an out-group. Here's just a few examples of how norms have been used effectively across different domains. These are the energy reports that I spoke about earlier that are now being used not just in energy but also in water conservation and recycling. Norms can also be conveyed through testimonials, so that is providing photographs and testimonials from people who are similar others talking about their experience and highlighting their engagement in a particular action. So we've got many tools that are available to us, the 5 that I've presented to you as well as many others that we can use to develop our strategies. But just because these social science tools have grown out of social science doesn't mean they're going to necessarily work in your case. So it still is very important to, in the next step, move to pilot testing. So we pick the best tools that we think address our particular situation. We include efforts to reduce barriers and enhance motivations. And then what we need to do is to deploy that program on a small scale, or maybe several variations of the program, to determine if it's effective before we roll it out across the wider community. A few comments about pilots here is that number one, it allows us to identify and address problems. So for example, if you've identified a door-to-door campaign as your primary focus and people are reluctant to answer the doors, that tells you something about whether that campaign is going to be effective on the wider scale. Pilot testing also allows you to test out different program variations. So perhaps you test out a door-to-door model against a mail model or against a door-to-door model that includes an incentive or some extra element of the program. While this is an extra step and adds some cost to the overall program, in the end it's a cost-saving mechanism because it saves you from implementing an ineffective program. but it also, you can determine the return on investment for various programs. So if through a very staff-intensive door-to-door program, you get a 20% increase in participation, but then through a less staff-intensive mail administration of the program, you get 15% increase in your program, you may decide to go with mail because even though you got less participation, you're able to deploy it more broadly because of the lower cost. So the pilot testing can really help here in allowing you to evaluate the return on investment of various strategies. The last comment I want to make here about pilot testing is that pilot testing is not deploying the program across your community for a year and waiting to see what happens. These are typically short-term pilots done over a couple of weeks or a couple of months, depending on the particular behavior and how long it takes to detect it. So lastly, before I turn it over to Katie, just to kind of sum up the process of community-based social marketing. As I mentioned, it's 5 steps. Within those 5 steps, we have a number of feedback loops built in. So if you conduct barrier and benefit research and you find that the barriers are simply too great for you to overcome with your existing program, maybe people need to have some sort of financial incentive and you don't have the resources to do that, you can't buy the bins for your residents, then you might need to go back and select a different action for people to engage in. Similarly, if you've pilot tested the program and nothing's working, you might need to go back and revisit your strategies to see if if you have effectively overcome the barriers and benefits. And lastly, if you've pilot tested, and this doesn't happen very often, but if you've pilot tested a number of different strategies and you're still not getting behavior change, you may need to go back and determine whether you've identified a viable behavior change. So with that overview of community-based social marketing, I'm going to turn it over to Katie Phelps, who is our project manager here at Action Research and was involved in 2 community-based social marketing efforts directly addressing organics collection. Katie, turning over to you.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. So as Jennifer said, I'm going to be presenting 2 case studies. The first focused on residential organics collection and the second focused on commercial. We're going to go through how each of those went through the different steps and the results of the pilot. Okay. So our first project is with Stop Waste, which is a public agency that is focused on reducing waste in Alameda County, California. Specifically, we worked with Stop Waste on their residential compost collection program to increase diversion, specifically meaning decreasing the amount of organic material that's still ending up in the trash bin as opposed to the green bin. So step 1, behavior selection, looking at who is responsible for placing organic material in bins. Of course, it's residents. We're going to be focusing on behavior of residents and households. For the extent of the problem, what you see here is a graph of an average waste audit in Alameda County. They conduct a variety of waste audits on a regular basis, so they have a good idea of what is in the trash bin. So what you see here is that garbage is only 47%. So you have 33% of the waste stream is still compostable behavior and compostable materials, with the slightly larger on the food scraps and then the paper and 20% on recyclables. Next, we're identifying barriers and benefits. We did this through a mail survey conducted in Alameda County with a 37% response rate. We were able to also link this mail survey with actual residents' bin sort data, so we could not only see their responses to the survey, but then actually link it to how the audit of their trash looks, so see their self-report behavior as well as evidence of their actual behavior. What we saw is that people generally had positive attitudes towards green bin recycling. They felt it was very important and overall not that difficult. So a good amount of existing positive feelings and positive results. What was really most interesting is that we saw that there was no relationship between people's self-reported behavior and their bin sort results, meaning how much of the organic material they believe already goes in the bin and what the audit actually found were not significantly related, meaning that just because I say I put a lot or all of my organic material in the bin, my bin audit does not necessarily reflect that. What we took from this is that there are potentially knowledge gaps that people may believe they're putting all the applicable material in, but when the actual bin sort is happening of their trash bin, there is other material that we would say that should have been in the green bin, but the customer is unaware of that. In addition, we can see that people are not necessarily cognizant of either their own behavior or the behavior of other members of their household. Since we know that people do value green bin recycling, and are saying that they're doing it and yet not, we can potentially leverage some of those mechanisms Jennifer mentioned previously, self-perception, that people want their behavior to be in line with how they perceive themselves. If they perceive themselves as green bin recyclers, but they're actually not, we can help leverage that to motivate their actions. We also saw that there were concerns about pests and smells, which was, of course, expected with anyone who's worked in residential organics recycling. So using that research, we developed 3 different pilot programs that were tested against each other, as well as a no program control group. The first is a composting report. This is similar to the O-Power report that Jennifer showed before, where it's speaking to the composting rate of the neighborhood as opposed to other neighborhoods around it, creating that social comparison. The neighborhood in question that this was given to is the one in orange there that is below average. And the idea here, again, as Jennifer spoke to before with social norms, is motivating that action to get people up to average or even above average because these people were below. And this is speaking to the entire neighborhood, as this data was not available for each individual person, but looking at people applying, well, if my neighborhood's only composting at a below average rate, likely it is that my neighborhood is not that myself and my household is also composting at a below average rate. What you'll also see here in the bottom right corner of the front page is a testimonial from a local resident speaking to positive experiences with composting. And then on the back side of this flyer, which was delivered by mail, is process-based information on how to compost successfully and hygienically and avoid some of those pest and smell barriers that people were concerned about. The next program was 2 hang tags that were developed. These were, the first one was looking at the first 2 are 1 hang tag back in front, and then the second 2 are the first back in front. Delivered on 2 different weeks, utilizing positive communication, really engaging imagery, as well as on the back having imagery speaking to the materials that were often seen still in the trash bin, and that should be really going in the green bin to provide that prompt and correct potentially some knowledge barriers that people may have that are causing them to put the wrong materials in their trash bin as opposed to in their green bin, and could also be placed near their bin if the resident felt they needed a prompt to help them or their household participate. Finally, they were also given a kitchen bin, which you can see in all the way on the right on those images. That was the bin they were given. They were also given a small sticker that could go on the front of the bin, providing the same images as a prompt to help people remember and participate and, as I said, correct some of those knowledge barriers. And again, leveraging the similar positive communication, engaging imagery, and as well as with this one directly addressing some of those convenience barriers where here you actually have a kitchen bin provided to residents that you can use to collect your food scraps. So if you didn't already have something, this is now giving it to you, and this is delivered to people's doorsteps. This was pilot tested in 5 different communities in Alameda County, specifically in the city of Fremont. And what we found, based on, again, waste audits of participants' bins after the treatments had been put into place, is that all conditions showed a significant decrease in the amount of compostable material that was in the trash can, while our control, no program group actually saw an increase in material. So what we can see here is that, while we're obviously not still getting to that 100% mark, they're causing a decrease in the amount of compostable material. But I do want to point out here is that the decrease for the three different groups is statistically the same. While the hang tag number is much larger, it is actually statistically a similar decrease across all groups. And this gets back to what Jennifer was talking about with pilot testing, where you can look at different programs and consider, of course, providing the countertop bins is a higher cost. So that may not be the best method to go. If you can get a similar decrease from just providing 2 hang tags, what you can also think about is if potentially in the future you could combine these programs or do one and then the other, to see if there might be different ways to utilize them. But looking at your return on investment here, you can, help decide which method you want to go with. So case study 2 is a commercial organics collection that we worked with. So we worked with the city of Sunnyvale in the state of California. There's concern about coming into compliance with AB 1826, which requires that producers of organic waste must now divert that waste to the compost stream as opposed to landfill. So the city of Sunnyvale wanted to better understand how they could assist their restaurants in complying with the law and make this a voluntary and positive process as opposed to one that's based more on enforcement and compliance and fines and such. So we started with step 1, behavior selection, looking at who is responsible for putting organic waste, specifically food scraps. This is the food scrap only program, into bins. And in restaurants, as Jennifer touched on before, there's a lot of different people and a lot of different behaviors that go into how organic material ends up in the bin. There's everything from bussers emptying post-consumer food to chefs working with prep, and those potentially have different barriers and contexts, from having to strain liquid from soups prior to disposal versus mixing scraps from scraping scraps from the cutting board, but still needing to pick out potentially rubber bands, plastic waste, versus sorting out spoiled food from the fridge. Each of these behaviors happens potentially different staff members in different contexts and may need to be addressed differently. As well as, of course, patrons. Depending on the restaurant, some, of course, especially fast food restaurants, have people disposing of organic waste as a customer. If we're looking at the extent of the problem, Jennifer showed those EPA graphs earlier, looking at how restaurants are one of the biggest chunks of organic waste in the commercial industry. That's one of the reasons that this work focused on that. For step 2, identifying barriers and benefits, as this is still a fairly novel area of research, especially when we're talking about drilling down to the level of looking at different staff members, different behaviors, and what those different things entailed. We focused really on a qualitative and literature approach, so interviews and a literature review. So we interviewed restaurants that do and do not already participate with compost collection programs, as well as researching program managers that run organic composting programs in commercial industry. So identifying a fairly wide range of barriers from space in the kitchen, fast-paced environments with time to dispose and sort, forgetfulness, lack of knowledge, financial, language barriers, but also identifying a wide range of benefits from respect for food, reducing waste, doing the right thing, the restaurant being a leader, and of course, compliance with the law. Using those barrier and benefits, we developed a strategy. And again, since this was a fairly novel program, we actually had a City of Sunnyvale staff member, Lisa Colejo, actually going to several restaurants, helping put these materials into place, observing what was going on, how they were being used, how we could make adjustments, and making sure that they fit the context that different restaurants needed to collect just a wealth of information on these situations. So we developed a prompt flyer, which I'll show in the next slide, a fact sheet about the program, mostly for the manager and getting set up and engaged. Lisa provided a large amount of verbal guidance on participation as well as working one-on-one, as you see here, with setting things up, as well as a list of discounts and incentives for bins. So you see here for the strategy, the prompt flyer here, initially they were thinking about going with a more generic flyer that's already in use for residential communities, but through these discussions and this work, we realized that a lot of the materials that were pictured on that were not necessarily relevant in a restaurant environment. For example, having takeout boxes, which also, since this is a food scrap only program, those pictures aren't correct. So making sure that this is customized to the plate scraping kind of behavior that you'd see in a restaurant, as well as the kind of materials you'd be more likely to see, and addressing what were the top questions that Lisa was hearing, whether you can put in meat or bones, spoiled food, that you should pour off liquids, etc. So as I mentioned, the pilot test was fairly intensive, one-on-one, working with first an introductory meeting, then a waste characterization, which helped us better understand what kind of materials were going out in the trash and what kind of materials are being used. We then rolled out the materials. The City of Sunnyvale staff member was there to do observations and interviews and understand how the program was being utilized, as well as doing lid flips to see whether there was still contamination. Overall, some of the most key learnings we found were that any program being introduced must already fit into existing restaurant food processes. To make any modifications, significant modifications to how food already moves around the kitchen was going to be a lot harder than trying to fit it in. Videos and images were much preferred, not only for any language reasons, but given the amount of turnover that chefs and restaurant managers wanted something they could easily pass on to a new staff member. Contamination, still the biggest across-the-board challenge. One of the restaurants dealt with this by having to check before you scrape. So not only trying to get people to reduce their own contamination, but having staff members watch out for others. So having kind of a double check if, say, person A who just put something in, put a contaminant in, hopefully person B who was putting something in next would pull it out rather than it then getting buried and stuck in the bin and part of the contamination. Ultimately, the one-on-one communication, as Jennifer mentioned, that's the most influential method, is really helpful, but of course not scalable when we're talking about getting this kind of program into place across all restaurants in an entire city. But given their wide variety of needs, we need to make sure that it's customizable, so discussing the option of workshops, or whether you can have restaurants that will be leaders in their own community, speaking to how they fit the program to their program. And that's it. So here there are a few CBSM resources you can use, some websites. CBSM.com has Doug Mackenzie Moore's Fostering Sustainable Behavior book available for free. Tools of Change is a lot of other, both CBSM.com and Tools of Change, there's a lot of case studies you can use, discussion forums and listservs you can use, and other books.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jennifer and Katie, for such an in-depth and yet you really touched on so many different topics, and walking through the various steps is illuminating and raises a lot of questions, like, oh, how does this work? And, if you've already have a program and now you want to modify a behavior change, how do you switch that up? So maybe before we get to the questions in the chat box, because there is a critical mass of both in the commercial, institutional, and residential sectors, these separation programs, collection programs. What's a good strategy they're doing the behavior, but they're not necessarily doing the correct behavior? If you could just sort of hone in on that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. This is Jennifer. So I think sometimes where programs go wrong are advertising what not to do. And we assume that if we say, don't put this in the trash, that people will make the correct choice and do the right thing. So one way to address that is to be sure that the messages are very clear, and rather than saying, here's what not to do, we want to tell people what specifically we want to do. So put these items in this bin, for example. Another way to address that would be to take a look specifically at what people are doing incorrectly. So for example, some work that we've done previously with curbside recycling, we found we took a look at what's going in the trash cans that should be going in the recycling bin, what's going in the recycling bin that should be going in the trash. And one of the things that we learned is that it was principally junk paper, mixed paper, that was going into the trash can. So we were able then to tailor our message rather than to say something like, hey, recycle, and here's all the things you can recycle. We were able to come up with a strategy that very specifically addressed mixed paper, and even beyond that, addressing the reasons that people had for not recycling mixed paper, which were primarily tied to privacy of their information.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. Some questions from participants with regard to the Katie, your first case study with the neighborhood report strategy. The question is, how is this strategy not just reinforcing a negative social norm?
So it's looking at, if you can jump back to that slide. So looking at here, you see that the other communities around, that most communities have either an average or above average composting rate. So speaking to how most communities in the area compost at the average. So the average and the norm is to have a higher composting rate than your community is doing. Mm-hmm. So reinforcing that the norm is actually to compost better than this community is doing, and kind of help drive that behavior to that norm.
Okay, and excuse me one sec while I scroll, because there's another question with regard to case study 1. Bear with me. How did you determine the reduction of food waste in the trash, and how long was each pilot?
Each pilot was presented over a couple weeks, and how we determined, depending on either they got one composting report, the hang tags went out over a series of 2 weeks, and the kitchen bin delivery was over a week, and then they got, I think 2 weeks after the pilot was in place to, still time to adjust to either, acting or not acting as they would based on being delivered the treatment. And then we conducted actual audits of trash bins of a random selection of participants that received the program or of the control group who did not. So it's actual sorting of trash bins.
Okay, excellent. And I'm sorry, I was trying to find the next question, but real quick, the length of the pilots?
They were delivered over a couple weeks. I want to say it was a month in total.
Gotcha. All right. Thank you. This is for both Katie and Jennifer. Do you have suggestions on how to change social and business behaviors of the hauler, carters, transfer stations? In other words, we focus a lot on the whether in the commercial setting, the institutions, the employees in the residential setting, the households and institutions, the students or whomever. But what about messaging to the behaviors of haulers, carters, transfer stations who are contracted as service providers? So just they, in some cases, can be on the front lines of addressing a behavior change.
Right.
Yeah.
So one thing I've found with this process of community-based social marketing is that it's very adaptable to a wide range of audiences. So for example, you might be dealing with occupants of a building, but you're also dealing with people who are managing that building. So the process works, but what you would need to do in that case, and I know you probably all love if I just said, oh, here's a strategy or a message that works, but really I can't answer that without knowing what the behaviors are that those individuals are engaged in and what are the barriers and the benefits around engaging in the desirable actions. So I would say that you could address that effectively, but you need to take a look at what are the behaviors that you want them to engage in. Is it maintenance of their vehicles so that things aren't falling out? Is it the way that they're picking things up? What are the activities that happen at a transfer station might be different than the activities that are happening by the drivers. So looking at what is that overall problem, why are those audiences important to address, and what are the behaviors that they're engaged in that are contributing to that problem. And then breaking down from that or learning either through some probably one-on-one interviews, what are the things that are making it difficult for them or what would make it easier for them. And when you have that information about the barriers and benefits, then it'll become very clear what you need to do. We could make assumptions. We could say, oh, well, what if we gave them bonuses or we gave, it reflected their job performance evaluations. But without information about why they're not engaging in the correct behaviors, we can't really jump to that strategy. It could be something as simple as a faulty equipment or how their schedules are set up or just simply lack of knowledge. So really important to identify the behaviors and then do that research.
Excellent. Thank you. One question here, which is interesting because it's from a state where there is almost no food waste recycling underway. The question is, how do you change behaviors when the behavior doesn't exist to begin with?
Yeah, so that's kind of an example of where voluntary behavior change can fill the gap until you've got policy. So if you don't have any collection infrastructure, then there isn't, and I'm working on a series of programs in Canada where this is the case. They want to divert waste from the food waste, organic material from the landfill, but there's no collection infrastructure in place. So first and foremost, getting that collection process going, getting the contractors on board or the public support, that's a start. But also, in the meantime, getting people engaged in related behaviors. So maybe it's backyard composting initially. Maybe it's source reduction behaviors. And this is anytime you can get people already engaged in these repetitive actions, then you're helping to build that self-perception and that identity of the way they see themselves. I'm the kind of person that cares about keeping my organic material out of the landfill. So while they may not be able to participate in a collection program because you don't have one, they can participate in other related behaviors. So that would be one way to go about addressing it. Now, if you have a program and people just aren't participating, then so you can't use things like social norms, then what you would want to do in that case is identify people who are well known and well respected in the community to make a commitment to engage in that behavior, make that as public as possible, encourage conversations, and then really just wait for that behavior to diffuse throughout the community.
Excellent. Thank you. We had a real flurry of questions here, so I apologize. I'm trying to read quickly to see how many we can fit in the next 2 minutes or so. So I'm going to take this one. Do you have any additional suggestions for how to tackle behavior change around compostable products since there are so many lookalikes on the market? I've found consumers are confused by what is compostable and should be composted versus what seems like it should just be recycled.
Oh, I thought you were going to take that one, Nora. I can take it.
Oh! I can take that. Sorry, no, I'm not answering questions today.
Oh, okay.
I only get to ask them.
Yeah. I thought you said you were taking it. No, that's fine.
No. I'm sorry. As far as selecting here, sorry about that.
In terms of there being confusion, yeah. I mean, within this domain, really, it's really hard to come up with a universal message that everybody can use because the types of materials that are compostable vary by whatever kind of processing you might have in your individual communities. So I think, again, this kind of goes back to that first step in identifying what your problem is. Are you finding a lot of compostable material in the trash that could be composted, or is it just sort of one of those things where you pay attention to it because you know this to be a problem? So first to be make sure it's a problem, and then second, identifying clear actions that you want people to engage in. So really just kind of understanding what are all of the materials that are out there. Are they making their way into the waste stream, and is it a significant problem? So starting there. If there are a wide range of products, what things are occurring with the most frequency, and then start there. And again, the reasons go back to barriers and benefits. So when it comes, the reasons that people might have or the perceptions people might have around compostable plasticware might be different than what they're getting in the lunchroom as far as like containers, and just depending on how those things are used and where they're used. So really looking at the material and what's winding up where you don't want it to wind up.
Excellent. And the rest of the questions are pretty comprehensive, but let's just end with this one from one of the participants. So I start out a program, we're just going after coffee grounds and tea bags and, sort of very limited scope of materials. And then you want to start adding, meat and dairy as your composter says, you know what, I can start to take this, I'm allowed to take it. What's the best approach to going back to people? You've created a behavior, but now you're going to introduce some new things.
Right. And I think there, again, it's important to be sure that you're continuing to effectively address barriers. So it may be pretty simple for people to throw their coffee grinds. There's no large smell associated with it. You typically don't get a lot of bugs, but then now you've introduced meat, and you've got a whole new set of barriers potentially. And so you need to make sure that as you introduce new behaviors, you can have a campaign with 5 different behaviors, but that you've addressed the individual barriers for each of those behaviors. Because it's not just barriers to organics recycling, the barriers exist at the level of the individual materials. And so really making sure that either in that foundational research or as you introduce new materials that you're gathering some research, some kind of research, even if it's at a minimum literature review or some intercept interviews in the community, that you're building your strategies based on that information about how they perceive that material, not necessarily how you as a program planner might.
Excellent. Bear with me 1 second. So I think because there are so many more questions and they all are fairly complex, I think we'll stop there and want to thank so much Jennifer and Katie for this just very impressive webinar, and I encourage those of you participating, if they're going to be speaking at a conference near you, they're amazing in person as well. And we also would like you to consider joining the Composting Collaborative. There's no fee. It's open to any company, organization, or government entity. And there's an easy application to fill out, and that way you'll get on the list to receive the newsletter and also announcements of webinars. And we do tackle some in-depth topics, several of which will be featured at the Composting Collaborative Summer Dialogue in Nashville, Tennessee as part of WasteCon on August 21st. And two of the deeper dive pieces of that is, one is looking at sort of doing due diligence on on-site food waste pretreatment systems. Green Blue, as part of the collaborative, has been doing a lot of research, looking at different systems, talking to end users. So there'll be a presentation on that. And the other is looking at how to build organics recycling infrastructure in areas with strong structural support from states and municipalities, but really that area doesn't have regulations requiring diversion. So because we'll be in Nashville, we have a great panel of representatives from both the state, D.C., the city and county of Nashville, as well as several processors. So hope to see you all there. And there were a lot of questions. We appreciate everybody who persevered through the audio portion of this. We got a lot of people registered literally right before the webinar started, so Green Blue had to do some back behind the scene work to expand the audio. But most important, you'll be getting a recording of this webinar and all the slides to accompany it very soon, and that'll be available to all of you. So thank you so all very much for participating today. Thank you to Action Research, and I particularly thank Green Blue because they are so adept at bringing these webinars to us. So thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.